Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also especially the invitation to deliver this lecture. Let me start here. So I already said some of the introduction here that, yeah, the big issue in current times is the Great Recession of 2008 and 9 and its aftermath, that we have seen this very pretty long slowdown, very low interest rates, sometimes called the zero lower bound here, and its effects on macroeconomic activity. Let me start with a few figures to just show you that, yeah, this is indeed a major event. So here's US real GDP per capita in dollars. I mean, it's actually in constant dollars, 2010 dollars. That's the vertical scale. And what you see here is, of course, if you remember the dates, that here's the US economy was growing pretty well here, but then suddenly there was the Great Recession in 2008-9, as you can see from there. And it was not just a recession, because after that the growth started to pick up, but somewhat more slowly than before. And anyway, this gap that was created never went away, so far has not gone away. So it tells us that, yes, this is a serious issue and a long-lasting issue as well. Now here's Japan, and so the same kind of story, that there was of course, Japan has had slow growth already before, but then came the Great Recession 2008-9. Again, somewhat of a recovery, but then the growth afterwards, after a first stage of recovery, has been slower than before, and again the permanent gap seems to be there, and is not going away. Here's Euro area. A broad picture, again similar, that there was a in fact, fairly fast growth, and then the Great Recession came. GDP per capita dropped significantly. It picked up at first, but then Europe even hit a sort of a double dip recession. A new recession came in as you can see, in about 2010-11, and then continued until 2013, and now the growth has been picking up. But again, there is a significant gap from the previous trend path, and in fact, in the case of Euro area, the level overall, the level of GDP, real GDP, is slightly below the previous peak, even now, which was in 2008. So it's a serious long-term issue. So what can we do about it? So here are just summarizing these questions, that we have a major decline in GDP and then a slowdown in economic growth after that. And Japan, in fact, had an earlier one when the zero lower bound became prevalent in Japan. They had an earlier similar kind of decline, which was not in the figure. Some of these, as I said, there are clearly aspects which are associated with the financial crisis and problems there. I'm going to basically not consider these in any detail. One could have considered them in the way of shocks, but I would not have a sort of a mechanism to deal with these endogenously, with the consequences of this in this. So one should do that, but I'm going to focus on this issue without that feature, because basically I want to argue that, yeah, it could happen without the financial crisis too. And then going on to economic theory more, it turns out that in fact analytically this thing has to do with the possibility that economy may have multiple equilibria, multiple resting points, and these multiple resting points in fact come out very naturally. So in some sense, the before the zero low bound and the after the low bound are two different types of equilibria. Now let me explain this. Now I'm going to use a few formulas and symbols here. Let me explain this a little bit, but I'll try to be. So first of all, let's think about monetary policy in simple terms, which is something called the Taylor rule, where this is actually a gross interest rate, and this is the sort of net term, and then there's a gross inflation rate. So this is where interest rates that the central bank sets depends on the rate of inflation, and usually in such a way that if inflation goes up, then the interest rate is going to be raised more than once. It's something called an active monetary policy rule. Then another feature that you get in many macroeconomic models is something called the Fisher equation. Fisher equation as a steady state relation, which says that the nominal interest rate is equal to inflation rate divided by the long-term real rate, which is actually multiplied by that, which is actually given by the consumer's time preference. So this is a very standard equation. Those who know economics and know that there's in consumer optimality, there's something called the Euler equation. A steady state imposed on the Euler equation will result in the Fisher equation. And so that's the situation here. And in terms of a figure, this is what you get. So we have a Fisher equation. It's a straight line. That's not necessarily the origin. I'm just drawing it as a straight line somehow. And then I'm drawing here the interest rate rule. And usually we think of economies being somewhere here, like a 2% inflation rate, if that's the inflation target. And then the monetary policy rule has this feature that the curve is relatively steep here, so that you raise, if inflation goes up, the policy authorities raise the interest rate by more. And then that's the case. Now, what happens is that interest rates also have this zero lower bound or approximate zero lower bound, which here, because it's the growth rate, is a lower bound of 1, because that's 1 plus the net, plus the net interest rate. So this policy reaction function will have to start bending like this, because R cannot go below 1. And so if that's the case, and if we have a continuous reaction function, there has to be a second intersection here, by necessity, just by continuity of the reaction function. And so so we have two possible steady states in this situation. And let's look at this a little bit next on the inflation and interest rate data. Now here are again those two curves. Those two curves, they're not statistically fitted into this data, but what has been done here is to put the data from the US, those are the black diamonds you see mostly here, and then you see the final period somewhere around here. On the horizontal axis I have something called the core inflation, and then we have the key policy rate on the vertical axis. Then the gray squares is Japan from 2002 to 2013, and you see it's here. And then the euro area are these crosses here, and they drift around here, but the most recent data is here. This stops at last summer. So basically what we're seeing in terms of interpreting this in terms of the previous figure is that Japan, yes, it's somewhere near the low equilibrium, near the low steady state. And the fact that these recent data on the US and euro area in particular suggest that maybe they are also creeping into that possibility, or something like that. And so that also tells us that we has some evidence that we have to take this multiple equilibria problem seriously. And of course economists have done that. So there are various modeling approaches here. So I'm gonna start with I will go obviously to more details later on, but I will start with something what's called this second steady state and things that it creates we call a liquidity trap. This is a term introduced by Keynes, of course, and this is perhaps somewhat different in meaning to that. But I'm going to call this an expectations-driven liquidity trap for the reasons that come up more clearly later. But it's basically saying that because we have the two-state equilibria, somehow something has to, expectation and data will be different in the two equilibria. And so expectations could have a role in determining which one of these equilibria is going to be there.